Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily. Today is Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. On today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking about the latest film and TV news. My name is Ben Pearson. I'm an editor at slashfilm.com, and I'm joined on today's episode by Slash Film editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
All right, everyone. Sorry that I missed yesterday's episode of the podcast. I may or may not talk about why that is at a future time. But in the meantime, Brad, let's talk about some big news stuff, including a news story that just dropped right before we started recording today's episode, which is a new Matrix movie is on the way from director Drew Goddard. So this will be the fifth Matrix film. We don't really know much yet about whether or not Keanu Reeves or Carrie-Anne Moss is going to come back, for example. But what do you think about Drew Goddard stepping into the world of the Matrix?
Well, I'm a Drew Goddard fan, so I love Cabin in the Woods, and I feel like he's a very exciting genre filmmaker. And so anything to inject some new blood into the Matrix franchise, I think is a good move. And that's coming from somebody who has immense respect for the Wachowskis, but didn't necessarily love the Matrix Resurrections, but very much still has an affinity for the original Matrix. And the Matrix Reloaded, even though I think the Matrix Revolutions kind of shits the bed and doesn't deliver on the promise of what Reloaded sets up. I think Reloaded is a phenomenal sequel.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like it's time for, I feel like the Wachowskis have said everything they wanted to say with Matrix movies, and so to try and force them to continue to do something else within that world is probably unfair and would only do a disservice to both them and us. So
Right.
bringing somebody like Drew Goddard in, I think, is a smart move, and I'm at the very least, I'm very curious to see what they have in store.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. Jesse Ehrman, who is the president of production at Warner Brothers, said Drew came to Warner Brothers with a new idea that we all believe would be an incredible way to honor the Matrix world by both honoring what Lana and Lily began over 25 years ago and offering a unique perspective based on his own love of the series and characters. The entire team at Warner Brothers Discovery is thrilled for Drew to be making this new Matrix film, adding his vision to the cinematic canon the Wachowskis spent a quarter of a century building here at the studio. So, yeah, I think a new idea where Goddard was the one who pitched it seems exciting to me. Like the idea, of course, that the studio just wants to keep a franchise going for recognition's sake is something that was almost satirized directly in the Matrix Resurrections. But this seems just to come from maybe more of a purely passionate place, I guess, on Drew Goddard's part. So yeah, very curious, like you, to see what happens there. Our next story involves an HBO series that seems like it could have a lot of potential from where I'm sitting. Tell me about that, Brad.
Yeah, so Tim Robinson, he has been skyrocketing to really just great comedic fame recently, thanks to his sketch comedy show, I Think You Should Leave. It is endlessly memeable. Like, you see GIFs from so many sketches from this show all across the internet all the time. It is a hilarious show. I've rewatched it countless times. It's become a show that, when I travel somewhere, I always make sure it's downloaded on my Netflix account so that I can just pop it on and watch because the episodes are so breezy. And so Tim Robinson created I Think You Should Leave with Zach Caden, who's a comedy writer, a comedian who he's been working with since he was on Saturday Night Live. In case you didn't know, Tim Robinson was once a featured player on SNL for a brief time, and he also wrote on the show, like many cast members do, along with Zach Caden. And now they're getting a chance to create a new show at HBO called The Chair Company. It is a new comedy series, of course, and the show is described as being about... After an embarrassing incident at work, a man, played by Tim Robinson, finds himself investigating a far-reaching conspiracy. So you can imagine the kind of absurd comedy that can come from that kind of situation. I feel like Tim Robinson and Zach Caden at this point, they can do no wrong. And HBO, even though the HBO doesn't really feel like a big destination for comedy like they used to, at one time they were kind of comedic giants, and they do have a tendency to support up and coming voices that are, still blossoming, even though they've found success. And I feel like Tim Robinson and Zach Caden firmly fit into that. And so seeing what they have up their sleeve and doing it somewhere like HBO, I think is incredibly exciting.
I was going to ask you about that, like the sort of prestige TV-ification of Tim Robinson. Like the idea that he went from Detroiters, which was on Comedy Central, and was kind of like a smaller show that has a cult following, but was never like a huge hit or anything, to I Think You Should Leave, which is, again, has definitely a cult following and has become like internet famous as a show, but is like funded by Netflix, which at the time it greenlit the show basically had like a blank check to just pay out people and take all sorts of creative risks and stuff like that. Netflix is a much different company now than they were, I feel like, when I Think You Should Leave just first came out. But now, like, moving into HBO, it kind of, I don't know. What do you think about like HBO as the fit, as the home for something like this from Tim Robinson, who's a guy who's not been scared to push the envelope and be super weird in the past?
I don't know what to tell you, bud. HBO is just taking videos of funerals and showing the ones where the bodies fall out. No, even though HBO has become more focused on like prestige television, even more so than comedy in recent years, like HBO is still a destination for great comedy. You have Barry is not necessarily like the most straightforward comedy, but it is a funny show. And they're still the home of Curb Your Enthusiasm. They're the home for Veep, Righteous Gemstones. Still very much a good show. Insecure, another recent hit for them. So they do find these great comedic voices and essentially give them the opportunity to create what you would call prestige comedy, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there's an opportunity here to do that for Tim Robinson. It's hard to know exactly like what he's going to do at HBO. Like I can't imagine, it's like a retread of similar things they do. I Think You Should Leave. But knowing his more, alternative and peculiar comedic sensibilities, I feel like it'll skew towards something like in the Nathan Fielder arena or something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too, and I hope that that HBO budget actually allows him to really explore that conspiracy element to the fullest. Because, like you said, just hearing that logline and being familiar with Robinson's work, you can already kind of see in your head, like, imagine scenarios where he's just going down a rabbit hole into a deeper, darker conspiracy, and just what could start as a very small premise could blow up into something pretty gargantuan pretty quickly. And I hope that they just have a lot of fun with this idea. So I can't wait to see more from this show. Let's see. Alex Garland, the director of Civil War, is going to be taking a long break from filmmaking. There's not really a ton to say here. He's basically been saying this for a couple of years now, that once he was done filming Civil War, he was going to stop directing for a while. And I guess in a recent interview on the press circuit to promote Civil War, he reiterated that and just said, nothing's changed. I'm in a very similar state. I'm not planning to direct again in the foreseeable future. I think he's just kind of fed up with the Hollywood studio system and all of the bars that he has to clear. And he feels, I interviewed him for Annihilation a few years ago, and he just seems like a no bullshit guy who is very much like an artist who is into making things with a very familiar group of collaborators, and just does not really have any patience for outsiders coming in and dictating, the way that things should be. So that's kind of like the state of Hollywood right now. And so I can understand why somebody like him, who has such a clear vision for his projects, would bristle a little bit at that structure, I guess, for how the industry is operating right now. So I hope he comes back and makes more movies at some point in the future if he feels like it, because he's just a really talented filmmaker and somebody whose movies I always find really, really enjoyable and like thought-provoking, even if I don't always love them. Like, I'm thinking of Men, one of his most recent movies. It's just like a wild swing, and I like that the movie exists, even if I didn't like outright love the film itself. But do you have any thoughts on Alex Garland taking a long break here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bummer. I think he's one of the more exciting voices in filmmaking today, and so like it sucks when someone like that feels like they need to kind of step away. You want someone to keep doing, telling stories like that, but it's also like probably one of the most exhausting professions there is, with so much pressure every single time you're working on something. So you can't blame him.
Yeah, I'm going to very briefly mention that Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the upcoming, I guess you would call it like a reboot of the Planet of the Apes franchise, has a runtime that's been revealed, and it sets a record for the franchise. I'm not going to say what that is. I'm just going to encourage people to click on the article in the show notes. So I'll drive a little bit of traffic there and hope that people can get a deeper dive than what we have time to get into on today's episode. I did want to mention this other news story, though, which is that Scott Derrickson and C. Robert Cargill, who are the duo behind movies like Sinister and The Black Phone, are going to be making a movie called The Night of the Hunter, which is an adaptation of a 1953 novel. Very famously, it was adapted into a movie already in 1955, starring Robert Mitchum, and Charles Laughton, the great actor, was the director of that movie. And that's the only film that Charles Laughton ever directed before he died a few years later. But man, that is a terrific movie. Have you ever seen The Night of the Hunter, Brad?
I have not.
Oh my God. It's like, I really strongly recommend it. It's like an incredible film noir, hugely influential on people like Guillermo del Toro. And it feels like a twisted fairy tale, like a haunted fairy tale almost. It's about this guy who is a fake preacher who's actually a serial killer who like rolls into different towns and like takes advantage of these women in the towns to basically just like get money and kill people eventually. And he is in prison with this guy who reveals that he was in prison for stealing a bunch of money. And he tells this fake preacher that he put this money in his daughter's doll. And so this guy goes to that town, gets out of prison before the father, and goes to that town and tries to seduce the guy's wife and like worm his way into their family and try to like sneak around and find this money. Oh man, it's such a great film. So the idea of Derrickson and Cargill tackling that story is really intriguing. It's also like, oh my God, you guys better be careful, because Night of the Hunter is like a classic and people love that movie. It's just like a straight up masterpiece. But Cargill tweeted recently, for those unfamiliar, Night of the Hunter was based on a novel that was much darker than the 1950s would allow. Very excited about this project and thrilled that we can finally talk about it. So it sounds like it's not going to be a beat for beat remake of the 55 movie, but something that leans more into that darkness that he mentioned there. So I've not read the novel. I'm not sure how dark it gets, but man, the movie is pretty dark too. So I can't imagine, or I'm looking forward to seeing actually what these guys do, because they're obviously like very familiar with, going into the dark corners of everyone's psyche and exploring that stuff in the horror space. So, all right, let's take a break and then we'll be right back with another listener email. All right, Brad, have you ever had any experiences with disk rot or like your physical media being corrupted in any way?
I don't know specifically disk rot, but like I know I've had some older discs kind of just it probably is because of disk rot. I just don't know it, but like they just start not playing as well anymore. They kind of skip and like have issues. So yes, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, Ryan and I and the listeners have been having this ongoing conversation about the importance of physical media, and there's also, we've been talking a little bit about the potential downsides of like storing things physically, and disk rot came up recently. And I have since received what might be what I think is the platonic ideal of listener emails. It's pretty long, but I want to read most of it because I think it's valuable information for people to have, especially people who've been following this conversation that we're having. So this is from Yi Fing from Boston, Massachusetts. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He says, I hate to bug you, but the recent podcast conversations about disk rot and backing up physical media have some misinformation that I'm hoping other listeners will write in and correct, but here are my corrections. And then he provides 4 bullet points. Number 1, Hollywood/MPA issue commercial discs that are copyright protected by CSS, AACS, BD+, ROM mark, and probably many more techniques. You cannot insert a disk into your computer and use a file explorer and just copy the disk. You'll get an error. Point number 2, if you want to back up anything from the disk, you'll need to bypass copyright protection by using tools like RedFox and DVD Fab. Please note that at the time of this writing, US copyright law basically stipulates that you do have the right to back up the stuff as long as you purchased it previously. But the tools used to actually rip those disks are illegal, which is why all of them are from outside of America. And he links to an article from Lifehacker that goes into that a little bit more. And he says it's a bit of a gray situation, kind of catch-22 scenario. So just a warning there. And then Handbrake, the point number 3 is about Handbrake, which is a service that another listener wrote in and mentioned to us, and we talked about in our most recent conversation about this. Yifeng says Handbrake is only a tool that will recompress and shrink your disk files. For example, a Blu-ray may contain a movie file that is 35 gigabytes, but you can use Handbrake to compress that down to 10 gigabytes. That's what the tool does. Handbrake and compression tools do not rip disks, as they do not bypass that copyright protection that's put in place by the MPA. And then the fourth point is, finally, regarding disk rot, the Library of Congress has a study on that from about 14 years ago, but it's still relevant. And then he links to that. So I'm going to put that in the show notes if anybody wants to check that out. He says, basically, the net sum is that it is an extremely small, and that study encompassed computer CD-ROM beyond just movie disks. Let me re-say that because I don't understand what the fuck he's talking about here. 1 second. He goes on to say that basically the net sum is that it basically doesn't happen very often. The study encompassed computer CD-ROM stuff, not just movie disks. He says, if anything, the disk qualities of today's quality assessment far surpasses what used to happen 14 years ago, which was already pretty small. He says, if you care for it, the disks will outlast humanity. Like previously, most of the rot has to do with users storing disks in high humidity and non-environmentally controlled locations. So it's kind of what Ryan and I talked about, where if you like take care of your disks and store them in a place where it's not like directly in the sun, for example, then it's probably going to last okay. He says, obviously it's made out of plastic, and basically we know that it's going to degrade over time. But are there manufacturing errors? Absolutely, but they're extremely minuscule. Here's an example from Criterion, and they still offer that program to replace disks. So there's a link to that too. Hopefully this clears up some confusion. The quick summary is you can rip them, but you'll need to bypass copyright protection, and disk rot is basically a non-issue. And then Yifeng points out that data degradation happens digitally as well, and suggests that a potential positive use of AI might actually be to help make sure that those files are not corrupted as they're being stored and copied and backed up repeatedly over the years. So I'm going to paste the rest of his email in the show notes in case people want to check that out. But I just want to say thanks for that email, because it's like very, very methodical, point by point, sort of like, all right, this is, going through all the issues that we talked about. And I appreciate that. And also it doesn't like, say, hey, you guys are friggin' morons. What are you talking about here? It just like provides helpful information and has links to back things up. So that was great. I don't know, Brad, like, have you ever, I know that I'm bringing you late into this conversation that Ryan and I have already been having, but have you like had conversations like that with your friends, people who collect movies and, on either DVD or Blu-ray or anything? Like, is disc rot and that sort of degradation something that has been a common talking point among your friends anecdotally?
No, I honestly don't have a lot of friends, at least not locally, who have physical media collections. I'm pretty much kind of like one of the lone people among my close group of friends who still buys movies on disc. So those kind of conversations usually don't come up unless it's me saying, physical media is a lot better, because they're like, I can't find this. And it's like, oh, cool, I have it on disc. So
Okay, great. Well, yeah, if anybody else has any questions or anything else they want to write in to sort of contribute to this conversation, I'm all ears, and we'll definitely appreciate that. So that's going to do it for today's episode of the show. You can find much more about all the things that we mentioned on today's show at slashfilm.com. I will link to a bunch of them in the show notes as well. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday, bringing the most exciting news from the world of movies and TV, as well as deeper dives into the great features you can find on the site. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, and mailbag topics to us at bpearson@slashfilm.com. Make sure to leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention your email on the air. Don't forget to take a minute to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That does help us out a ton. Tell your friends about the show any way you can. Thank you so much for listening.